Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm joined here with Sharon Vanin, and we're going to be talking about legally leveling up your nutrition practice. So really, as nutritionists, if we don't run our businesses in a legally safe way and a sustainable way, it has the potential to jeopardize all the stuff that we're working so hard for. We really leave ourselves open to potential issues. So for today, we want to try to help you understand how to avoid legal mistakes that you might not even know that you're making. So we'll be discussing topics like choosing a structure for your nutrition business, having really key legal agreements in place for working with clients, dealing with insurance, how to handle working across borders if you're doing that. So as I mentioned, I'm here with Sharon Vanin. She is a holistic nutritionist and a lawyer for health and wellness professionals. She's the founder of the law practice Thrive Legal Care and its sister template shop, the TLC Source, as well as her nutrition practice, Wellcome Home, which focuses on finding food freedom through intuitive eating. You're a busy lady. Sharon is a graduate of the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, Osgoode Hall Law School, University of Toronto, and Queen's University. And she combines 16 years of legal experience in the health sector with firsthand experience as a wellness practitioner and entrepreneur to help you stay legally safe in your nutrition business without the stress and overwhelm. So welcome, Sharon. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Veronica. It's my pleasure. And I am a practicing nutritionist and part of this community through my own professional side of my life as a nutritionist. So I'm part of this community. So I'm really excited to share this with my colleagues and peers.
Amazing. So let's see if we were having a little bit of trouble on the Zoom end with screen sharing. So Sharon, if you want to see if you're able to pull your slides up, and if not, I'll share them on my end.
Yeah, it's really weird. I don't know why I'm not seeing my screen doesn't appear to be showing up. So we might have to use the PDF that I gave you. Unfortunately, that will just require some scrolling.
Of course.
Okay.
Let me see if I can full screen this somehow for all of us.
Yeah, and I'll share the slides as well, and they'll be part of the resources for anyone who's live on the call today or for people who are checking it out after.
So you can see up on the screen our topic for today. I'll completely turn it over to you, Sharon, in just a moment. For everyone who's here, I see you using the chat, which is awesome. Please do keep that up as we go. But if there's specific questions that you want to be absolutely sure that we answer, throw those into the Q&A box, if you will, and then we can kind of circle back around to that stuff towards the end of our hour together.
Yeah, and just as a sort of an intro, and for just so I can direct my conversation to everyone here today, maybe pop into the message box where you're located, like what province you're in. And Veronica, if you don't mind going to the next slide.
Of course.
So you've already covered this. These are the 4 things that we're going to focus on today. And you can scroll down. You've already given me a lovely intro, so thank you for that. And then we can go to slide 4, which is really just, I want to set the kind of the ground here and to just assure you that if you are at any stage of your practice or your career as a nutritionist and you're like, I don't know what to do about the legal side. Do I have to care about this? Should I care? What do I need to know? Don't worry. This is very common. None of us learned this when we were in our training to be a nutritionist. So that's the whole purpose of this presentation today. So the next slide. Just my little disclaimer that I am going to be speaking today in a very general sense and not to take anything that I say as legal advice, because I'm just doing this for educational purposes and you're not officially my client. So that's my little disclaimer, and then we can move on to the next slide. So we're going to start off with what the best structure is for your business. Okay, so I see we have Sabina's in BC, Nancy's in Alberta, Jacqueline, Angelica, and Sarah are in Ontario. Okay, those are the most populous provinces in Ontario, and for what I'm going to be talking about today will apply to all of those provinces. So I don't know where people are at in their nutrition practice journey, whether you are practicing as a solo, whether you are working as a freelancer, if you have incorporated or not, but I'm just going to go through some of the basics of what a business structure looks like for a nutrition practice. And this applies whether you are a solo or whether you are working with another entity. So the next slide shows that there are 4 main types of business structures in Canada. We're going to focus only on the first 2, sole proprietor and corporation, because these are the structures that are most common for people working in our field. So you probably have heard of these things. I'm going to break them down to just give you a little bit more explanation of what they mean. So the next slide. So what we have here is a sole proprietorship, and this is often the starting point for many people when they begin their business. And yes, technically, to be an official business, to hold yourself out as offering services to the public in exchange for any kind of payment, you should formally register your business. And the easiest way to do this is a sole proprietorship. And this means you are the business, you are the sole owner, and you and your business, you are one and the same. You are not creating a separate legal entity. So that means any of your earnings that you receive through your nutrition practice, that gets claimed as your personal income. So you're taxed at your personal rate, and there's one and the same. You definitely can have your business expenses claimed against your income. So it would work just like a normal business, but you are not creating a separate legal entity. That's the main thing to know about a sole proprietorship. So on the next slide, here we have some of the benefits of this type of business structure. So it's very quick and easy to establish. In Ontario, I believe it's still $65, similar in other provinces, so very inexpensive. And you don't really have any administrative requirements beyond that, other than doing your annual personal income tax filing. And because all of your business income is taxed as your personal income, you don't have to do a separate filing. So that's actually a really nice bonus, because you're just counting everything as your personal income. The other thing to know is that if you are just starting out, or even if you are fairly established as a sole proprietor, you don't have to remain in this business structure if it no longer serves you. If your business becomes more complex or your circumstances change and you want to then incorporate, you always have that option. So the next slide shows some of the drawbacks with this business structure. And the main one is from a liability perspective. So when you and your business are one and the same, that means that all of your personal assets, whether that is a home, a vehicle, another type of property, any of your personal assets, they are on the line if in the chance, which I hope never happens to anyone, if you were ever sued, all of your personal assets would be fair game to be considered on the line for paying out damages. So that's a big consideration for people. That can seem daunting, and that is actually why many people decide to incorporate, because they want to create some kind of a legal barrier between themselves as a person and their business. The other thing with having all your business earnings considered your personal income is that you have to pay tax on all of that. You don't have the ability to say, I don't need to pay myself an income. I don't need to pay myself a full income from my earnings. Like, you might be able to pay your bills and meet all of your needs on, let's say, half of what you're earning. So in some cases, it's nice to be able to leave some of that money in the corporation itself, but you can't do that with a sole proprietorship. Another thing to consider is if your business is growing, depending on what direction you're going in, as a sole proprietor, it's really hard to get loans from a bank or another lending corporation. And this one is a little bit, it's not like a hard and fast rule, but there is sometimes a perception that if you are in business as a sole proprietor, that you're not as serious. So it's not really like true or not true. Sometimes there's a perception of that. So on the next slide, we will look at corporation. So a corporation, as I have alluded to, this is a completely separate legal entity. So you are creating a structure through which you are operating your business, but this structure is protecting you because it is not you. You are not one and the same. So with a corporation, it can still be a sole owner. It could be you. You could have other owners, other shareholders. You can hire people. There's lots of flexibility for what a corporation looks like. But the key thing is that it's a separate entity. So some of the benefits, which I've kind of touched on, is the big one is that it shields you personally from legal liability. So that means that any business that happens through your corporation, only the corporation's assets are on the line if you ever got sued, which is great if you have a lot of assets that you want to protect. Another thing is with a corporation, as you begin to make more money, you have the option of not paying yourself all of your earnings. So let's say your earnings were $200,000 a year, but you really only need about $90,000 a year to meet your day-to-day living needs. You can keep the remainder in your business, and you are only charged at the corporate rate, which is a lower tax rate. So there are definitely tax benefits to incorporating, which you do not have as a sole proprietor. If you are looking to grow and expand or take on some capital assets, you can definitely get a loan much easier if you are incorporated, because it just tells the lender that you've done the rigor of formalizing this business in a more robust way, and you are perceived to be less of a risk. And there's sort of that perception again where somebody is more serious when people see the LTD or the Inc. after a name. So some of the drawbacks of a corporation are it's more expensive. You're looking at a few $100s just to do the initial filing. And then if you are hiring an accountant or a lawyer to help you draft your articles of incorporation, this is the necessary documentation to create your corporation. That could cost you, you're looking, then sort of into the thousands of dollars. Another big thing is that you have to do annual filing for your corporation, and you have to do 2 tax filings. You have to do your own personal income tax filing, and you have to do the corporate tax filing. And just a heads up, if you are not incorporated already, it usually is quite a bit more expensive to file a corporation's taxes compared to a personal tax. So just something to keep in mind. And then just some other general considerations. So just to note, there's no one structure that's better than another. It's always going to be about what makes most sense for your personal needs. It's going to vary from individual to individual. So you want to look at things like, do you have other sources of income? If you do have other sources of income, which a lot of people do when they're starting out a business, you want to think that if you are going to have your business be a sole proprietorship, remember that all of your nutrition earnings will be added on to your existing salary. So if that bumps you up into another tax bracket, it might make sense for you to incorporate so that you can shield that money from having to pay additional income tax. So lots of things to consider, definitely worth going through the analysis with your accountant. It's also helpful to talk to a lawyer about this to get some good guidance that's going to be tailored for you. And so likewise, you also want to think about like, what kinds of assets do you have? Do you have a spouse? Because you're going to be taxed jointly. And what's your personal risk tolerance? Some people don't feel deterred by the unlimited liability that you face as a sole proprietor, whereas some people are like, that sounds really scary, and so they want to incorporate. It's really just about your personal needs and goals. And so that concludes our section on business structures. And now we're going to move on to the next slide, is key legal agreements for working with clients. So I get asked a lot, do you need to have agreements? And I always say yes, 100%, because one of the most important things in your business is your clients. Like, it is actually the most important thing, because if you don't have clients, you don't really have a business. And so I always advise people, you want to do whatever you can do to maintain effective relationships with your clients. And one of the best ways to do that is actually by having really good legal agreements. And I'm here to dispel the myth that presenting a client with a legal agreement is like a big turnoff. We kind of sometimes think in the wellness space, people are so nice. I'm doing a service that's helping people. Why would somebody want to sue me? And my answer to that is you just never know. It really does happen. Probably doesn't happen often, but it can happen at any time. You just never know, and you don't want to be blindsided without having that protection in place. So we'll go to the next slide, and here are, I would say these are the 5 minimum agreements that you should have. The last 3 only pertain to your business if you have a website. So if you are working as a freelancer through a clinic or some other business where you're not maintaining your own personal website, you don't have to worry about the last 3. But whether you are working as an entrepreneur or working through a clinic that's owned by somebody else, you should always have 1 and 2. And we're gonna break down what 1 looks like, because this is an area that causes a lot of confusion for people. So on the next slide, I've sort of mapped out the difference between a consent form and a waiver. So this is really important to know. They are not the same thing. In law, a consent form serves a very different purpose than a waiver. So really briefly, a consent form, why you have it is because in Canadian law, anytime you are providing any kind of a service that is a healthcare service, it's a legal requirement to obtain somebody's informed consent. You can't do something to them in any way that's going to affect their health and well-being without their consent. So the consent form is just a formal way of noting that that informed consent process happened. On the other hand, a waiver is a tool that we use in law when you want to transfer certain liability from you as the business owner to your client. And really what that means is anytime you're offering a service, there's always some amount of risk. The risk usually in our line of work, it's a very small risk, but it's there nonetheless. And so you want to let your clients know that they are going to be assuming that risk. They are going to have to use their own discretion about whether to use your service, and it's on them to understand what the limits of your service are. So you can see here, there's a pretty wide hybrid of what a nutrition practice looks like. The way I practice is going to look really different from the way Veronica practices. So her and I, we're going to have different legal needs, and not everybody is going to need the same consent form or the same waiver. And sometimes you might need just a consent form, and sometimes you might benefit from having both. The times when you will only use a consent form and not a waiver is if your practice is a very clinical practice. So if you are holding yourself out as a nutritionist who is doing any kind of testing, you are helping your clients with very specific recommendations around food, supplements, lifestyle, if you are helping analyze any kind of results of blood work, any of the tests that are available, I would say you are definitely providing nutrition as a form of healthcare, and you will only want to use a consent form. And that's because of that legal requirement that I mentioned. In Canadian law, you have to have a consent form, and there are certain requirements. When you are providing healthcare, you can't waive your rights. You can waive your rights if you are providing nutrition in a more educational way. So if you were doing like a kind of corporate lunch and learn type of thing, or if you were doing educational, let's say you have a course or a program where you're not providing individualized advice to people, I would say that looks more like a non-clinical type of practice. And in that case, I would say, yes, it's always helpful to have a consent form just because it's good for transparency. But in those cases, you can use a waiver. So I know there's a lot of people practicing nutrition in a clinical type of way, and they're using waivers. And I want to tell you that those waivers are probably not going to hold up. So this is a pretty important distinction. And I don't think that it's really being talked about, which is not your fault, because there's not a lot of lawyers who really understand our niche. So hopefully this is illuminating for you. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these different types of agreements. So we can move to the next slide. So like I said, I kind of went through this. Consent, it's really about informed consent. So this is all about empowering your client. It's a legal requirement. And the whole reason that we do this is because the law recognizes that we value autonomy over our body and our right to choose our care. And you might be thinking, really, in the last 3 years, does this really hold up? Yes, technically it still does. And we still want to uphold this, even though, circumstances might not always appear that way. It is still important for you to do that because it is a legal requirement. And the really important thing with a consent form is it has to tell your client the benefits and the risks, and they have to be able to make an informed decision on their own without any undue influence that they are going to agree to your service, even though there might be some risks. And it has to be very precise. It's not a one size fits all kind of thing. So next slide is, so I've kind of already mentioned this. It's really like when you should use it. Use a consent form if you're on the healthcare side of the spectrum. And I also think it's always appropriate to use it even if you're not on the healthcare side. So the next slide is a waiver. So as I mentioned, a waiver, that just means you're giving up certain rights, transferring them to your client, and this is a risk management strategy for you. There really is no benefit to a client to signing a waiver. This is really kind of a one-sided legal tool, so that's important to keep in mind. And just like the consent form, it's not a one size fits all. A waiver actually has to be pretty carefully drafted so that it reflects your exact situation. And something to note for both a consent form and a waiver, you have to get your client to sign it before they commit to receiving your service and before they pay you. If you are asking your client to receive treatment or receive any service from you or pay you, and then you ask them to sign a consent form or a waiver, they're not going to, those documents will be legally invalid. So next slide. And I've kind of touched on this already. It's not appropriate to use a waiver if you are providing healthcare because you cannot waive the rights that a healthcare provider has toward their clients. So next slide is the client service agreement. So this is a totally different type of agreement. I always recommend that you use it whenever you're working with a client, whether that's one-on-one or in a group, whether you are doing live treatment or live service in a brick and mortar setting or online. And this really sets out all the parameters of what you do and do not offer in your service. And this just helps make it very clear for your clients. It's really important for helping to manage expectations. And it just puts everyone on the same page. And, if you are going to use this agreement, I also recommend this is where you put your provisions around how much your service costs, and very important to state what your refund policy is. And you should always have a refund policy. It's up to you whether you do or do not allow refunds, but it is really, really important to put your position around refunds in writing. And if you are doing both group, like one-on-one and group, you just want to make sure that your agreement is properly drafted, because those types of clinical settings or your practice settings, they're going to have different legal needs. So you want to have an agreement that's specific to one-on-one versus an agreement that is specific to a group. I just asked Sabine, this agreement also needs to be signed. Yes, it does. So the signature creates a binding legal agreement. So next slide. And these are the last 3 agreements that I'm going to talk about. And these really only pertain if you have your own website. You always want to have a privacy policy. This is a legal requirement for every Canadian business, and it just lets people know that your website, most websites will behind the scenes have like technology devices like trackers, cookies that are automatically collecting identifiable information from people. So you want to let them know that. Your website may also have an opt-in form where people can contact you. That's going to be collecting information. And the purpose of this policy is just to let people know that you recognize that you have a legal obligation to protect their privacy and that you are going to do that and you have a system set in place. Then you want to have website terms of use. And I call these your house rules for your website. And the reason that you want to have house rules is because your website is available to anybody in the world. And you want to make sure that they are using your website in the way that you intend. So you may have content on your website that is helping inform people about health and wellness. That information can be misconstrued by people, and you don't want to be responsible for somebody's misunderstanding. So you will clarify all of those things in your terms of use. And then you also want to have a disclaimer. Your disclaimer can be a standalone blurb. It could also be built into your terms of use. And this really just puts visitors on notice that when they visit your website, they have to use their own discretion and that you are not going to be responsible for how they interpret your information. So that is the end of our three.
We just had a question come into the Q&A box. If I can throw that to you now. Nancy said, I'm a pharmacist and a nutritionist. I have a disclaimer of liability only. She can read blood work results, but she's also, as a pharmacist in her province, able to send her clients for blood work. So she's asking, my understanding is that I need a consent form, not a waiver. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So your profession-specific act in your province is probably called something like the Pharmacy Act, has designated the controlled acts that you are allowed to perform. And before you perform any of those, you must get consent. It has to be express consent, best practice, put it in writing. And so it's a little bit of a unique case where you're incorporating nutrition into a regulated professional practice. You have to meet the higher bar, which is obviously the bar set by your professional regulatory requirements. So some of what I'm saying can carry over, but you always want to make sure you're meeting the higher legal bar by your regulatory requirements. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Excellent.
Okay, great. So now we're going to talk about insurance. Just a quick one. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, do you have to have insurance? And the answer is legally, no, it's not a legal requirement, but it is a very good business decision to have insurance. So on the next slide, I'm going to explain why this is such a good decision. So what does insurance do for you? It provides you with a pool of funds in the event that you get sued. It's kind of, think about it like car accident insurance. You never have to use it until you're in an accident. And I hope that you never have to, but it's nice to know that there is a pool of available funds should you need to rely on it. And usually your insurance will cover your legal costs if you get sued. So what it also does is it enables you to have relationships and work in different ways. So if you wanted to do, let's say, corporate wellness events, or you wanted to, be a guest lecturer in somebody else's course, anything like that, usually that organization is going to require that anybody who works with them or for them, and this includes private clinics, like if you were working as an associate or as an independent contractor, you are almost always going to be required to have insurance, just because it gives that corporation or that other body the peace of mind that they're not going to be on the hook for you, that you have done your due diligence and have taken out your own policy. And really it is about your peace of mind. And it's very inexpensive to have insurance to practice nutrition. It's, usually it's less than $500. Sometimes it's even like half of that amount, which is a pretty small price to pay, I think, for peace of mind. So I always recommend that you get it. So on the next slide, you will see that insurance does not protect you from legal liability. So this is an important distinction. You want insurance in place in case you get sued, but whether you have insurance or not, you still have to perform to the level of meeting your client's expectations in the best way that you can. You still have to meet any legal obligations that you might have. None of that goes away just because you have insurance. So think of it again in the driving context. Just because you have insurance doesn't mean you can drive through red lights, right? You still have to take other measures and make sure that you are trying to minimize your risk as much as possible. Insurance is not enough, but you always want it in your back pocket. So next slide. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize either. If you are incorporated, you may need to have 2 separate insurance policies. So insurance is there, you can have insurance that covers you as an individual practitioner. And if you are a sole proprietor, that is what you're going to want to have. And if you are incorporated, you may also want to have corporate entity insurance, because remember, a corporation is, it's you as a person, and then there's your corporation as a separate entity, and they don't have the same legal liability, so you might want to get both, and that is going to depend on your personal situation. So I'll just kind of leave it at that, because it's hard to generalize when you may or may not need it, but just know that there are those 2 different kinds of insurance policies. So the next slide is things you want to consider when you're shopping around. And I do recommend shop around, have conversations with different agents or brokers to make sure you're getting the policy that meets your exact needs, because your policy really will only cover you for exactly what types of modalities you are offering. So if you are a nutritionist and then you decide you're going to do a yoga program, if that's not written on your policy document and something happens to a participant in your yoga offering, your insurance will not cover you. So you want to make sure that you're getting the right fit. So your things that will affect your rate or the scope of your policy will be whether you are delivering your services in real time, whether you are virtual, where you are located, what modalities you use, and if you sell products. Yes, Sabine, so can I speak a little bit about what to consider when you provide services in other countries? So I actually have a section on that. It's the last section, and I'm gonna jump to that, but we'll come back to the insurance question because it's an important one for people who are providing their services across borders. So on the next slide, so I've already mentioned this. Oh no, I didn't mention this, sorry. Another thing to keep in mind is your policy is only effective for the period in which the policy is active. So if you have a policy that is renewable on a yearly basis, make sure you don't let it lapse, because if something happened and a client made a claim for you in that period of lapse, you would not be covered. So you always want to make sure you're on top of renewing your insurance. And like I said, it's not illegal to practice without insurance, but why would you? It just doesn't make sense. It's so inexpensive, and it really does give you peace of mind. Okay, and then, so this is the section on cross-border practice. So yes, Sabine asked about what things to consider. So because nutrition is not we're not regulated at the provincial level like other professions like pharmacy or dietetics or medicine, you are not tied to practicing in a single jurisdiction, which is really good news for us because it gives you a lot of freedom to open your doors across the world. You can expand your scope. These are all good things, but you have to realize that there are some caveats, and you want to make sure that you are properly tying up any loose ends so you can minimize your legal risk. So on the next slide, these are some of the considerations for practicing across borders. So I always tell people it's totally fine to offer service to people outside of your home province or outside of Canada or whatever your home country is, but you have to be really transparent about where you're located, because it does affect your legal rights and the legal rights of your clients. So for example, waivers are not recognized in all jurisdictions. There are several states in the US, Connecticut being one of them, where waivers they're not a thing. So if you had a client sign a waiver and they were based in Connecticut, and if they had an issue with you and they tried to sue you, your waiver would not hold up. So it's important to know that your agreements have to really be specific to the clientele that you're serving. And so what would you do if you had a client who was located, let's say, in Connecticut? So your options are, you could take the chance and provide them service anyways. You could not offer them service because that's a risk you don't want to take on. So there's different ways of managing this and approaching it. There's too many variables to kind of go through what that could look like for you, but I'm just flagging this as an FYI, that when you do cross borders, you're kind of opening up a can of worms sometimes. So another thing to note is that you don't want to do anything that could creep into the scope of a regulated professional or into the scope of things that are not allowed to be performed by a nutritionist in the jurisdiction where your clients are. So let's say, say you have a client in California, and in California, nutritionists can do, X, Y, and Z that we are not allowed to do here because it's a controlled act in Canada. You want to make sure that just because it's allowed, just because a nutritionist in California can do that, that you are not doing that, because that creates confusion for your client. So these are just things that you want to be really mindful of. So if you do have a lot of clients outside of Canada, you might want to just talk to a lawyer who understands this, just to make sure you're kind of everything is above board. And then another thing, and this is going back to insurance, is that insurance is territorial, which means that your insurance is going to cover you for the location where your business is based or from where you are practicing. So unfortunately, like the insurance industry has not really caught up with the mass transition that people have been making in the last few years to virtual businesses. And for the most part, they do recognize that you will have some virtual service, but it's not perfect yet. Like we may kind of eventually get there, but just know that if you are a Canadian, your Canadian-based insurance will almost always cover you for any claims brought in Canada, but it may not cover you in every jurisdiction outside of Canada. Usually because the practice of nutrition is fairly low risk, you shouldn't have a problem, but it will depend. And this is a conversation that you should have with insurance companies before you commit to a policy, because you want to make sure that they're offering you that coverage. And not all insurance policies will. And so that might mean you get a different policy from another company in addition to your base policy. There's different ways around it, but again, this is something to flag, that your Canadian-based insurance is not necessarily going to cover you in the same way that it will cover you for any claims brought in Canada. So Natasha says, Lackner-McLennan seems to cover these items. To what extent, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I don't know exactly either, because it's going to depend on your practice and the modalities. Like it's not a one size fits all. But I can tell you that Preventative Healthcare Services is another insurance carrier, and they do provide coverage for Canada and outside of Canada. And they do that both for individual practitioner coverage and for corporate coverage. So do I have a favorite? No, I don't, because it's going to be so specific. So Lackner-McLennan is a common one that nutritionists use. Preventative Healthcare Services is another one. And then there's all manner of other insurance companies, like the big ones like Intact, Aviva, whatnot. It really, sometimes you have to kind of do a bit of legwork and get in touch with a broker, and they will kind of do a scan of all the available policies through different companies, and they can kind of try to match you with a policy that best meets your needs. It really is worth doing it. There's no charge to do that, and that's the job of a broker. They will match you with the policy that's best suited for your needs. So I always tell people, shop around. It's worth it, because you might get a better rate and you might get the coverage that you really are looking for. And the next slide. That's it. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll just leave my contact info here. And like I said, the slides will be available to you. And now we can turn the floor over to everyone here on the call, and you can ask questions, and we'll take it from there.
So we had that question from Sabine about providing services in different countries. So she mentioned Germany specifically. And I know there is a lot more from Canadians who are seeing clients in the US, but more and more, as you said, as things are going virtual and people are becoming more comfortable with that format, you're open to work with someone anywhere in the world. So are you able to elaborate a little bit more? Like, how would you find information, like with Connecticut as that example, what things you might need to be careful of when working with a client in a different country somewhere else in the world?
Yeah, it does sometimes just take a bit of homework, and like you're not expected to know these things. This is why if you do have an international practice, it doesn't hurt to chat with a lawyer, like somebody like me or another lawyer who understands how these kinds of things work, just to make sure that you're not you're not inadvertently doing something that you shouldn't be doing. In most cases, I do think it's fine. It kind of gets in, you might run into some issues where you're doing more of the testing, and you wouldn't be ordering, like requisitioning the tests yourself, because as a nutritionist, you individually can't do that. You usually will do it in conjunction with a provider who is authorized to do that, or you would be helping a client who purchases those tests themselves to do that. But the scope of nutrition in the US is quite different. So if you have clients from the US, testing is one area where it gets a bit tricky. That's kind of where, and it's hard to talk about specific examples because it's so person and business specific, but that one definitely comes to mind, just because in different states, practitioners there have different, their scope is different, and it's hard in the US too because there's 50 states, so it's a lot to kind of get a grasp on. And again, you don't have to kind of figure this out on your own, but if you have questions, talk to a lawyer. That might kind of help clarify things for you. Sabine, does that answer your question?
See what she says. There's another question. Are you able to tell us a little bit about what kind of forms you have in your shop?
Yeah, absolutely. So my shop is called the TLC Source, and it is really a one-stop shop for all of your legal document needs. I have all of the documents that I talked about here. So the waiver, the consent form, the website privacy policy, website terms of use, a website disclaimer. I have documents that cover the hiring process. So if you are a business owner and you are looking to bring on an independent contractor, like an associate or another type of individual who might be like a photographer or a freelance social media manager, I have those kinds of agreements. I have terms of use for one-to-one service, group service. I have terms of use for selling digital products. I have about 28 different agreements there, depending on the level of sophistication of your business. I'm sure you can find all of those things. The only thing I do not have in the shop is agreements for physical, tangible products. I do draft those, but I have to do those custom. You can't find them in the shop because there's too many variables for selling nutritional products or natural health products, but I do those as well. But I think take a look, you'll find a lot of different things. I have also 2 packages that are really great for nutritionists. If you're on the clinical side of things, I have a nutrition legal care package that has like bundled a bunch of agreements together. I have one for health coaches. So I've tried to cover all your needs. And I also have a code that did I give you the code, Sabine? I probably did, but anyways, I'll follow up with the code so that you can get 15% off any of those purchases if you so desire. And if you are looking for more customized legal advice, I always offer a free consultation as well. So we can have a chat. I can kind of direct you to what might be in your best interest for next steps.
That's a very valuable offer. Nice little free consult with a lawyer. That's excellent. And we've got another question popped up here. Are there any specific considerations for MLM type services? A lot of these would be all over the place too. And I think by all over the place, you mean different geographic locations.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Like anytime you're selling anything or engaging in any type of a service, there are always legal considerations. I don't have templates for that, but that would be more of a case-by-case basis because it's going to depend on whether the MLM is like a Young Living selling essential oils, or if it is a different kind of service, like goods and services have different legal considerations, but yes, there are definitely considerations. Okay, yes. So Sabine said I did give her the code. That's good.
Yes, we've got all that stuff. And of course, we'll make sure all of your contact information and everything is up with the replay as well. You mentioned at the top of the hour at noon that you are part of our community as well. So people can message you on Mighty Networks as well and connect with you that way. But we'll make sure we've got all your emails and websites and things along with the replay. Nancy sent another question here. Since every business is different, I assume that we can and should customize the templates you have in your shop.
Yes, absolutely. And I have designed the templates to be totally tailorable to your needs. And the way I've done that is I've built in a lot of instructions. I explain what every single provision of every single agreement means, which is a benefit for you because you understand what the agreement is all about, and that helps you communicate that to your client. And excuse me, you always have like that explanation as a reference in case you ever have to go back to it and you're like, what does this mean? I don't remember. You always have that there. And I explain what parts of the agreement can be tailored, what can't be, because sometimes there's just certain legal language that you have to have in an agreement. So that is all laid out for you. I've taken all the guesswork out of it. It's really quite simple, and it's really just kind of putting in your unique fact situation, but it's a very easy process.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions, so I'll put out one last invitation if you have any questions to either pop those in the chat or in the Q&A box, because we're getting towards the end of our time together. So I want to make sure we get all those questions in.
So you asked a question: have I ever worked with someone who got sued? So not sued, like, so okay. Here's the thing with getting sued. You can get sued for all kinds of different things. You can get sued for what we call malpractice. You can get sued over a business matter. You can get sued over somebody wanting a refund. There's a whole range of issues for which you can get sued. Often it doesn't get to that. And part of my approach to practicing law is I try to prevent that from happening. And one of the ways you prevent that from happening is having good legal agreements, having good communication, having good relationships with people. And that's kind of what I'm all about. I really take a preventive approach. Law, like healthcare, works so much better when you are on top of it and you are preventive. But yes, sometimes disputes happen, and it could be something like a client buys, let's say you had an ebook for sale, and if a client buys your ebook online, you don't know who they are because it's done digitally. They email you and they're like, I don't like this book. It doesn't meet my expectations. I want a refund. So what do you do? There's lots of things that can happen in that process. They can issue a credit card chargeback against you. They might threaten to post a negative review about your business online, all kinds of things. You don't want any of these things happening to you. So this is why I always say, so important to make sure you have all of this stuff in writing, because that's really your best and your first recourse, is to have really good documentation through terms of use, through client agreements, and that hopefully can intercept any further escalation of a challenge. But the reality is any one of us can get sued at any time for any reason, and you don't even have to do anything wrong. The kind of the psychology behind why somebody sues somebody is often they're unhappy, they might be going through stressful times. You just never know. It's kind of a wild card factor that you can't 100% control, but you try to patch up the leaks as best as possible. So it's kind of just the nature of doing business.
I will personally attest to that as well. I have had a claim levied against me that turned out not to be founded, and it all worked out well. And I had the proper agreements and all of those things on the employment front to show that I had crossed all my T's and dotted all my I's. So I will personally attest to that. When someone's going through a difficult time, sometimes they're just looking for any out, and it is really, really valuable to make sure that you have all these sorts of things in place to protect yourself. We have a couple more questions here. regarding the refund policy, do you have a template for that in your shop?
So I don't have a separate template for refund policy, but I always build that into all of my client service agreements. So you will find that in the one-to-one client service agreement, the group client service agreement, the digital products terms of use, and the digital course. Anything where you are selling your service, I built that in because it's so important and it's tailorable. Like I give you different options, like to say we don't offer refunds or we do offer refunds or partial refunds. That's totally your call, how you want to kind of where you want to draw the line. But yeah, it's always there.
And then the last question that I see, so I think this might be getting towards the end of our call here. Sarah's asking, should we put in the consent form that we don't guarantee any results or improvements?
Always, because you simply can't, right? That's just the nature of what this kind of work is all about. So yeah, that's a very good statement to put in there.
Wonderful. All right, I think we got through all of the questions. Thank you to everyone for sending those questions through. That made for some great clarifications and conversation around the use of these different legal documents. And thank you, Sharon, for sharing all of these wonderful tips with everyone. And of course, the discount code and the free consult that you're offering as well are such valuable offers.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I'm really happy to share this info and I'm glad to see the feedback. I'm so glad that people got something out of this today.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Sharon, for coming and educating us on these matters. And we'll be sure to share all of these details in the replay very soon.
Great. Thanks so much.
Take care. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.